Our first speaker this morning is Christopher Caldwell, who's a senior editor at the Weekly Standard, not to mention a prolific and top-notch writer. His essays, columns, and reviews appear in many places, including the Claremont Review of Books, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times Book Review, and the Spectator of London. He's the author of the book Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, Immigration, Islam, and the West. And he's currently at work on a book about post-1960s America. I have a feeling after the recent presidential election that he's making some revisions to that manuscript, or maybe adding a new chapter. His very timely topic today is how to think about Putin's Russia. Please welcome Christopher Caldwell.
All right. Well, thank you, Tim. And I'd like to thank everyone at Hillsdale College for having me here at this great National Leadership Seminar here in the desert, where it's so much warmer than it is back in Mother Russia. I want to thank Larry Arnn and Doug Jeffrey and also Kim Ellsworth for having arranged all of this. You know, it was about a year ago that I was first invited to discuss this issue of how to think about Vladimir Putin here. And in the intervening months, his importance has grown and grown and grown until this morning it seems to be at the highest ever. The strange thing, though, is it's not as if he's really done anything. But what has happened is that Putin has become a more and more powerful representative or symbol of the major conflict of our time, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. Putin is he's a highly effective ideological litmus test. He's a hero to populist conservatives around the world, and he's anathema to progressives. I don't want to get into the exercise of comparing him to our own president, but if you know enough about what a given American thinks of Vladimir Putin, you can probably tell what he thinks about Donald Trump. And in certain circles, what people think about Putin is a proxy for what they think about Trump. Now, I want to stress at the outset of this talk that this is not going to be a lecture about what to think about Vladimir Putin, which is something that you're quite capable of figuring out yourselves. It's a talk about how to think about Putin. And on this, I think there's really one basic truth to remember, although like most basic truths, it's usually forgotten. And that is that sovereignty is the key to sort of like judging most political questions. You know, our leaders in this age of globalization may have ignored it, they may have sought to deprecate it since the end of the Cold War. But that doesn't mean that it has ceased for an instant to be the primary subject of politics now. So in that light, you know, Vladimir Vladimirovich is not the president of a feminist NGO. He's not a transgender rights activist, and he's not a guy who delivers slideshows at the UN on green energy. He's the elected leader of a rather powerful, rugged, relatively poor country that in recent years has felt itself humiliated, robbed, and misled, sometimes with good reason. And his job has been to protect his country's prerogatives and its sovereignty in a world system that has been seeking to erode sovereignty in general and has been particularly antagonistic to Russia's specific sovereignty. At the outset, we should say that Putin's respect for the democratic process has been fitful, to put it kindly. He's cracked down on peaceful demonstrations. Political opponents have been arrested and jailed throughout his regime. Some have even been murdered, and I think most of us know their names. There's, Anna Politkovskaya, there's Alexander Litvinenko, there's Boris Nemtsov. And while the evidence connecting Putin and his circle to these killings is circumstantial, the incidents should not be ignored or downplayed. And yet, if we use traditional power political measures of judging the success of the Putin regime, and here I mean things like defense of borders, economic performance, national flourishing, and popularity, Putin does appear to be the most successful statesman of our time. And in fact, his only rival is a similarly controversial person in Turkey, which would be Tayyip Erdogan. I mean, for this generation, he has really achieved a lot. And by achieved a lot, I mean this. When Putin took power in the winter of 1999 and 2000, his country was pretty much defenseless. It was bankrupt, and it was being carved up by its new kleptocratic elites in collusion with its old imperial rivals. And Putin changed that. In the first decade of this century, he did what Kemal Ataturk had done in Turkey in the 1920s, which is out of a crumbling empire, he reconceived an empire as a nation state and gave it coherence and purpose. He brought those plutocrats to heel. He restored military strength. And this is the reason we may have a hard time seeing him quite clearly, he refused the subservient role in an American-run world system that foreign politicians and business leaders had drawn up for him. And that's why his voters, or a lot of them, credit him with actually having saved the country. Now, we in America, I think, tend to be very ideological about foreign policy because we have a great stake in the global system. Because we conceived it, we designed it, we benefited from it, and when we run it. So American intellectuals tend to assume that there can never be a legitimate historical reason to dissent from a world system. And I think intellectuals make that assumption with when they look at Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. I mean, the Philippines is a big, complex, interesting country. Why is it that I've read a couple dozen articles about Duterte, and every one of them comes down to saying, wow, they really must have gone crazy in the Philippines. You don't get a good sense of why people are doing things. And so we've followed this same route with Donald Trump, certainly, I mean, in the press. And I think the press have done the same thing with Putin. I think that they assume that he just rose out of the KGB to be a stock villain in the Western newspapers. And there's more to it than that. Putin didn't come out of nowhere. And there is a reason why the Russian people not only tolerate him, but they revere him, and a lot of them at least. And you can get a better idea of why he's ruled for 17 years if you remember that within a few years of communism's fall in the 1990s, the Russian life expectancy, on average, had fallen below that of Bangladesh. And that was the situation Putin inherited. It was not the situation he created. That was the fault of Boris Yeltsin. Now, Yeltsin, we know, was a kind of a picturesque, sort of drunken, kind of a reckless opportunist. And that made him a great foe of communism when courage was required. But it really made him an inadequate founding father of a free constitutional state. And that's why, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who gave as much as anyone fighting against communism, wrote in the year 2000, as a result of the Yeltsin era, all of the fundamental sectors of our political, economic, cultural, and moral life have been destroyed or looted. Will we continue looting and destroying Russia until nothing is left. And that was the year that Solzhenitsyn said that was the year that Putin came to power. Putin was the answer to Solzhenitsyn's question. Now there's two things, basic things, that Putin did that cemented the loyalty of Solzhenitsyn and of people like them. The first was he restrained, although he did not fully eliminate the role of the billionaires who were looting the country. And second, he restored Russia's, you can't say its old status in the world, but you can say that he restored the idea of Russia as a country to be taken seriously in the world. Let's deal with the kleptocracy first. Today, Russia remains a kind of corrupt country, a sort of a natural resource-based oligarchy. But again, we must remember that this is a system that Putin inherited. He did not found it. And the transfer, the privatization of resources after the fall of communism is one of the great blown opportunities, one of the great mishandled transitions of our time. It was a tragic moment for Russia, but it was in many ways a shameful one for the West. I think that Western political scientists provided a certain ideological cover for the looting of Russian resources, because they presented as a transition to capitalism something that actually had nothing to do with the transition to capitalism. And at the same time, Western corporations, including banks, provided a lot of the financing for the way these resources were taken away from ordinary Russians. Yeah, an important thing that we have to remember is that there was a governing class in Russia. It was a bureaucratically ruled state, and the people who would become Russia's oligarchs were, with some exceptions, there were some exceptions, but they were, in the majority, men who had been groomed to be the next generation of communist nomenclatura. And the reason they got their hands on the resources is because under communism, these people were the only people who really understood the scope and nature of state assets and how they were controlled and where they were. These were also the people who controlled the privatization programs. And as I say, they had access to Western financing. And so they wound up taking power, just as they had planned to back when they were in communist cadre school, but they did so as owners, not as managers. And given that under communism, the state had owned all the property in the economy, that was quite a haul for these people. And I'm talking about people like Boris Berezovsky, Vladimir Guzinsky, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and other billionaires. Yeltsin's reign was built on their fortunes, and vice versa. Now, Khodorkovsky has in recent years become a sort of a symbol of Putin's misrule, because Putin jailed him for 10 years. And that makes him a kind of an interesting case. His trial certainly did not meet Western standards by any stretch of the imagination. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't look at the nature of the privatization from which Khodorkovsky benefited. Stephen Lee Myers, the former New York Times Moscow correspondent, in his biography of Putin, calculated that Khodorkovsky and his fellow investors paid $150 million in the 1990s for the main production unit of the Soviet oil company Yukos, which came to be, or the former Soviet oil authority, which came to be Yukos, and which came to be valued by 2004 at $20 billion. And this means they acquired a large share of the essential commodity of Russia for less than 1% of its value. The thing that made the first source of resentment to Putin was that he actually had these people figured out. He was an ex-KGB man himself. And Putin came to refer to these people as state-appointed billionaires. He saw them as a conduit for looting Russia, and he saw himself as the man who would restore to the people what had been stolen from them. He also saw that on a strategic level, Russia needed to reclaim control of its vast reserves of oil and gas, on which much of Europe depended, because that was pretty much the only geopolitical lever it had left. So that was pretty much the way that was pretty much the route Putin chose to go to restore Russia's position abroad. And Russia's position abroad, when he came to power, was bad. As you know, they'd been, wiped out Vietnam War style in Afghanistan. They had failed to halt an Islamist uprising in Chechnya, and others were arising on their borders. But I think in a way, worst of all for them was the Serbian War of the Kosovo War, as we call it, in 1999, in which Russia felt itself humiliated by the United States and NATO. The Clinton administration back then backed a nationalist and Islamist independence movement in Kosovo. This is not the place to debate the rights and wrongs of this war, but one way to look at it is as one of the last wars that we fought on the same side as Osama bin Laden. But another thing we did in that war was to take the opportunity to show Russia its lowly place in the international order. Yeltsin got maneuvered into the position of allowing the dismemberment of Russia's loyal ally, Serbia, and I don't think it's an accident that Putin was president 6 months later. As he entered office, he said, "We will not tolerate any humiliation to the national pride of Russians or any threat to the integrity of the country." And I think that degradation of Putin's, of Russia's position is the thing that Putin was referring to when he made what is now probably his most controversial remark, which is when he called the collapse of the Soviet Union, quote, "the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century." I believe that when he's talking about that, he's talking about the humiliation of Russia and not the return to communism. But that's a little bit distant from our actual subject tonight. So, but when Putin said he would restore Russia's strength, he meant it. He beat back the military advance of these Islamist armies in Chechnya and Dagestan. He took a hard line on terrorism. Part of his strategy was a decision never to negotiate with hostage takers, even in secret. I think it's a promise that he mostly kept. And if you look at that, you notice that one theme runs through Russian foreign policy, as it has for much of its century. And that is, there's no country, with the possible exception of Israel, that has a more dangerous frontier with the Islamic world. So you would think that that would be a primary lens, the primary lens through which all of us view Russian conduct. A good place to begin anything that at first glance does not have an obvious rationale. And in fact, I think this is the way Donald Trump views Russian conduct. I think Donald Trump believes the primary thing about Russia is its frontier with Islam, not its attitude towards human rights. But you know, for about certainly the last 8 years, and more like the last 16, agitation in the West against Putin, criticism of Putin in the West, has had nothing to do with foreign policy, almost nothing at all. It hasn't had to do with Russia's intervention against ISIS in the war in Syria. It's had to do only in a minor way with Russia's intervention in Georgia and Ukraine. And I don't think it's really even involved Russia's harboring of the leaker and fugitive Edward Snowden. There have been two really concerted outrages about Putin in the last 3 or 4 years. And I think they've both been over matters that are of secondary importance strategically, but of primary importance to the world of liberal progressivism. And I'd say the first came in 2014 when the Winter Olympics, which were to be held in the Russian resort of Sochi, presented an opportunity to potentially damage Russia economically. Most leaders went, most world leaders went, but three leaders in the West, François Hollande of France, David Cameron of Britain, and Barack Obama of the United States, decided to make an example, make a stand against Russia, and they sent their respective populations into a frenzy. What over? I mean, if you look at it, it was a very short list of primarily domestic causes that were beloved of the progressive coalition that ruled in the US, Britain, and France at the time. First, there was the jailed oil tycoon Khodorkovsky, and Putin released him before the Olympics began. Second, there were the young women who called themselves Pussy Riot. They're often called a rock band. They're more a group of performance artists or political activists. They were jailed for violating the country's blasphemy laws after they disrupted religious service, chanting swears at the people celebrating. They were basically chanting, well, let's just say, I'm not going to mention it, but the television accounts didn't mention it either. Well, Putin released them too. And then the third objection to Russia at the time of the Olympics was Russia's Article 6.21, which was described in the Western press as a law against, quote, so-called gay propaganda. And if you look at it that way, it does sound like a sort of a strange Lovian limitation on free speech. But actually a more accurate translation of what the war forbids is promoting what, in the word is it's promoting non-traditional sexual relations to children in school. That's what it forbids. So even if you think, on all of these things, you had the governments of the West protesting Russia for things that its own populations would probably have approved of. And even if you disagree, even if you think that Russia should have cared less about religion or cared less about homosexuality, you still have to be struck that there's something very local about these issues, and there's something a little bit imbalanced about blowing them up into diplomatic incidents. Now, the second campaign against Putin is more recent, and in fact, it's so recent that I don't really know what to say to you about it because there have been developments about it even this morning. But I'm basically talking about the ongoing attempt of partly by the Obama administration itself, but partly by its allies in the public, to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the last US presidential election by implying that the Russian government somehow hacked it with its computers. This is really an extraordinary episode in the history of what Walter Lippmann called manufacturing consent or manufacturing opinion. And I certainly won't claim any independent expertise in cyber espionage, but I have to say that anyone who has read the public documentation on which these claims of hacking rest will find only speculation, arguments from authority by partisan sources, and attempts to make repetition do the work of logic. In mid-December, the New York Times ran an article entitled, "How Moscow Aimed a Perfect Weapon at the US Election." Most of the assertions in the piece, though, come from unnamed Obama administration sources and employees of CrowdStrike, which is the cybersecurity firm hired by the Democrats to investigate a hacked computer at the Democratic National Committee. The article quotes those who served on the Democratic National Committee's secret anti-hacking committee, including party chairwoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz and party lawyer Michael Sussman. And then in January, there was just before the change of administrations, there was a National Intelligence Council report that the government released showing where the heart of the case came from. And more than half of that report was devoted to complaints about the bias of RT, the Russian government's international television network. Now again, we don't know what the intelligence agencies know, and I'm not going to go out on a limb and tell you, that I know the truth of this story. But I do know that there is no publicly available evidence to justify Arizona Senator John McCain's claim that Russia engaged in an active war against the United States. And there is really nothing even remotely close to it. So, Democrats in general, progressives in general, seem to have gone to extraordinary lengths to discredit and demonize Putin. And why is this? If you don't believe that he is a direct threat to the country, which I do not, then you have to look at the consideration that there's always a zeitgeist or a spirit of the times. A given issue will become a passion for all mankind, and certain men will stand, for better or for worse, as symbols of it. So, a half a century ago, the zeitgeist was about colonial liberation, and you can think of, say, Martin Luther King traveling to Norway to collect his Nobel Peace Prize. He stopped in London, and he gave a talk about the South African apartheid system, about the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela, about the need to boycott it. Why did he do that? What did that have to do with him, Well, practically nothing, but symbolically everything. It was an opportunity to talk about the moral questions that meant most to him, and to say, I'm a part of that. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. And I think all of us do that with political figures and political institutions. We have a different zeitgeist today. Today, it is not decolonization that is the thing moving people. It's sovereignty and self-determination. These are the driving passions in the West. And the way they became the driving passions of the West has a lot to do with the way the Cold War conflict between the US and Russia ended. In the 1980s, the two countries, they were great powers, yes, but they were constrained. The alliances they led were fractious. After the Berlin Wall fell, their fates diverged. The United States became a genuine superpower. It was offered the chance to lay out the rules of the international order, and it accepted that offer. Russia was offered the role of submitting to that system. And just how irreconcilable the two ways of looking at the world became, or let's just say the two realities became, because I'm not certain Russia and the United States have irreconcilable interests, but for now they have irreconcilable realities. You can see it in Russia's conflict with the Ukraine 2 years ago. According to the official United States account, and by official I mean what the government and most of the papers say, Russia invaded its neighbor after a revolution threw out a corrupt plutocracy there. Russia then annexed Ukrainian naval bases in Crimea. According to the official Russian view of their government and their media, the Ukraine's democratically elected government was overthrown by an armed uprising backed by the United States. To prevent a hostile NATO from establishing its own naval base in the Black Sea, Russia had to take Crimea, which is Russian territory anyway, historically. And if you look at both of these accounts, both the American account and the Russian account are perfectly correct, understood within their respective traditions. It's just that one word can mean something very different to us than it does to them. In his book on Putin, or on Putinism, the great journalist and historian Walter Laqueur wrote, most Russians have come to believe that, quote, democracy, unquote, is what happened in their country between 1990 and 2000. And they do not want any more of it. So the point with which I'd like to conclude, given that, is that we'll really get nowhere assuming that Putin sees the world as we do. One of the more independent thinkers about Russia in Washington and D.C. over the recent years has been Dana Rohrabacher, who is a Reaganite California congressman. And I remember seeing him scolded at a dinner in Washington a few years ago. Rohrabacher had said that the United States should seek ways to cooperate with Putin. And the head of a foundation, I believe it was, said that he should be ashamed because his mentor, the great idealist Ronald Reagan, would have stood up to Putin on human rights. And Rohrabacher replied that although he did think Reagan was an idealist, he thought the great gift of Reagan as a foreign policy thinker was not his idealism so much. It was his ability to set priorities and to identify what constituted the biggest threat to the United States, and then to put all his eggs into the basket of fighting that threat. Russia was the biggest threat to the United States during Reagan's presidency. But Rohrabacher argued, and I would agree with him here, that today the biggest threat to the United States is not Vladimir Putin. So why are people finally thinking about Putin as much as they do? Well, I would say it's because he is a symbol of national self-determination against the US world system for the whole world. And he was the leading symbol of that, certainly at least until the Brexit referendum in Britain and the election of Donald Trump. People around the world, like him or not, see Putin as progressives once saw Fidel Castro, as one person who says he won't submit to the world that surrounds him. And just as 50 years ago, you didn't have to be a communist to sort of understand that the way Castro was carving out a space of autonomy for himself was a pretty powerful thing to those who agreed with him. In the same way, Putin's conduct is bound to win a certain sympathy, even from some of those who don't really share his view of things or share an idea that a strong Russia is a good thing. Basically, all the people who believe that the international system is not delivering for them. I would say that generally, if you like the international system, if you like globalization and the new economy, you're going to consider Vladimir Putin a real menace. If you don't like it, if you feel it has failed, then you're going to have a certain sympathy for him. Putin has become the symbol of the sovereignist side in the battle of sovereignty and globalism, and that turns out to be the big battle of our times, as our own recent election shows. Thank you very much.
We do have time for a few questions, so if you have one, just raise your hand and I'll come to you.
I have a question. In the Second World War, Winston Churchill, although he hated communism, welcomed the murder of Stalin into the war. And in retrospect, it seemed to have been a good decision. Can you make such a comparison now between Donald Trump and Putin with regards to wiping out ISIS?
I think that is the view. That is Trump's view. No, I mean, obviously I can't sort of promise that it's going to be a success in the way that Churchill's choice to ally with Stalin was a success on those terms. But I believe that is the motivation of Trump. There was an interesting column by Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times a few days ago, in which he talked about these two ways of looking at Russia. And Barack Obama used to talk about human rights and progressivism. Donald Trump talks about Judeo-Christian civilization. If you look at Russia in terms of human rights and progressivism, it's not a very useful country to us. If you look at Russia in terms of Judeo-Christian civilization, it's a very useful ally to us strategically. And I think that is the core of the shift in policy that you've seen. So I think that's a very good analogy that you make.
Putin is worth 30 billion plus. Did he not loot the Russian economy also? And how is he any better than the other autocrats he jailed? And my second question is, how would you characterize his political ideology? Is he a communist? Is he a capitalist? Or is he just another autocrat?
Yeah, Putin's money is a very interesting, it's a very interesting situation. There are a lot of people who, until well in his reign, say he had very little money at all. I mean, I think at the time, there are stories, particularly in the Stephen Lee Myers biography, about him running back into his burning house to rescue all the money he had in the world, which was about $5,000. And that was around the time he first became leader. I think one of the things that's happened since Putin became president is that he has closed off sources of information in Moscow. So nothing is leaked that Western journalists can really make use of, the way it was the case in the 1990s. So most reporting on finances in Russia tend to be done through banking authorities. That is, we didn't hear that, Ivan paid this much money to Viktor, to build that casino. We can see that this much money moved from this account to that account. So I don't think we are really certain that Putin personally is worth $30 billion. I think that we know that he's had to move a lot of money around to keep people content, particularly as the sanctions against him have bit. But how would I characterize him? I would certainly not call him a communist. I don't know. You can say he came out of the KGB, but there's a funny irony about the KGB, which is that under communism, there were a few things about the KGB. They were familiar with foreign ways. They had to master foreign ways. They had to learn about how to live in a Western economy. I'm talking about the foreign operatives, of which Putin was one for a while. And so they had a much clearer idea than anyone else in the Soviet bureaucracy that communism didn't work. And so, even Yuri Andropov, who was about the most ruthless head of the, one of the more ruthless heads of the KGB that the Soviet Union had after Stalin, was he didn't think communist worked either. So I think that Putin is that way. I don't think he believes in communism as an ideology or a system, but I think he's read a lot of. He described himself as a believer in God even during communism, which was which was a rather extraordinary thing. I mean, one of the unusual aspects of the Russian regime is the blasphemy laws that I just mentioned, under which, you know, that group Pussy Riot were prosecuted. I think that he has a certain idea of Russia. I think he believes that Russia as it is now is kind of in continuity with the way it was under the czars. I think he probably believes that a certain firm hand is necessary to rule it, and that a great deal of inequality might come with the territory of that culture and that economy. But communist would not be the word that I describe for him, that I would use for him.
Yes, I noticed during your talk that you didn't bring in at all in your talk the idea or the fact that religion and the restoration of Russian Orthodoxy, which happened between 1995 and 2000, had a great effect. Putin was even instrumental in having the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn is required reading in Russia at this time.
Yep.
And I looked at Putin a lot differently when I realized that it's not the communist lens that we should be looking at him as, but more as a nationalist lens that he is, and he's defending his country, and he wants to get the power back that he lost. And also, as a special forces soldier, realizing that the Islam population was big in Russia in their Dagestans and et cetera, et cetera. So I believe that we should all look at that part of the game about the religious aspect as a part of it. Do you agree, sir?
Yes, I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you on that. I think, you know, it's a deep and subject that would require a lot of discussing, and it's not really central to the question that I was asked to address today, which is how to think about Putin's Russia. But I agree that it's one of the most fascinating things. And you know, Ronald Reagan was convinced, and it was one of the things that led him to believe Russia could be negotiated with, that there was a great repressed religiosity about the Russians that was that existed in the people, even if you couldn't see it in public expression. And maybe Putin had a similar hunch, but there's certainly you know, none of these countries can ever return to, or none of these countries show signs of returning to, like, an old level of sort of society-wide religiosity. I mean, if you look at a country like Poland, even Poland, which is a very religious country, but it's not religious in the way that it would have been in 1900. It doesn't, religiosity is not something that is a consensus view of 90 or 100% of the people. It's an opinion of the conservative half of the country. But that's what Putin does rest on. And now that you mentioned nationalism, I realize that to this last question I got back here about what would I call Putin, I mentioned that what I wouldn't call him a communist, but nationalist is a good word.
My question concerns the structure Putin has in Russia behind him. Tom Reed was Ford's Secretary of the Air Force and then on Reagan's National Security Staff. And he tells the story that after the fall of the Soviet Union as the Soviet Union, he and other American Cold Warriors went to Moscow and met with the Russian Cold Warriors. And sitting across the table from each other, one of the Americans said, "You couldn't understand the panic we had when the hardliners pulled their coup d'etat against Gorbachev, we were scared of who had the Russian black box and might, to save his own skin, push the button and launch the missiles. And the Russians sat, looked at each other, smiled. A general spoke up and said, we pulled the button, we disconnected the cords on the black box, showing that there was real rationality at the top of the Russian defense establishment, even in the last days of communism. Now, our other opponents, like Shiites in Iran waiting for the 12th Imam, or Sunnis looking for those 72 virgins, aren't particularly worried about destroying the world, but is there a structure behind Putin, what might be called a routinization of charisma type thing? Is there a structure behind him of rationality that would continue if he were to drop dead tomorrow?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I don't know that I could give you any kind of authoritative answer. It's interesting to me when I consider that side of it, that when Putin was forced by his own country's term limitation laws to step aside for a term before he could serve his next 2 terms, he chose Dmitry Medvedev as his, as to be the president while Putin served as prime minister. That's an indication that it's very hard for Putin to find protégés in his entourage who are exactly like him. That the people around him actually might be a little bit more modern, they might be a little bit more Western looking than he is, at least the ones we can see. But I think that a lot of these, when you get into a government like that, it's hard to tell. So, but one thing I do think, I certainly do think that that you mentioned Iran and the Sunni terrorists. I think that Iran is a much more rational actor than these irregular Sunni terrorist groups and even the states that back them. But I think that Russia is just as rational and probably more rational an actor than Iran right now.
Kind of back up what the gentleman before me just spoke about. There's a lot of talk about World War III starting. World War III against China and Russia and the United States, and the world's going to go to war, and I don't think that's going to happen at all. I don't believe that China or Russia is even that stupid at all. I think that beyond Putin, I don't think they're that stupid, and the people in China are not that stupid. So, do you agree with me? Do you think I'm standing in the correct place, or do you think World War III is imminent?
Well, if I thought it were imminent, I'd probably be at home with my family. but yeah, in general terms, I do agree with you, definitely, yeah.
Why did Putin stop the spread of Christianity, squelch it in the last 2 months? Acquainted with that?
No, I'm not, sorry.
He said no spread of Christianity. You could not convert anybody. You could only talk within the confines of your church.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't see it.
The other question is, what do you think will happen to Russia when the price of oil, if it does, drops to 25 or 30 for a period of time?
Well, Russia has always been very dependent on the price of oil, and you even read people like Walter Laqueur, who, as I mentioned, I admire very much, who said, one of the things that was happening in the late 80s was that oil was falling to a record low. I think it fell below $30 a barrel. Laqueur said, you know what, if Gorbachev were a little more level-headed and could have just weathered the storm, his regime, the Soviet regime, might have survived. But he took the fall in oil for a permanent thing and figured that Russia would have to make sort of like permanent adjustments. In the same way, I think that there will always be a temptation in Russia to take high oil prices as being permanent and spend the money. I think one of the great successes of the Putin regime is that it has not really done that. It did not use the, high oil prices to collateralize debt and came out of the, I mean, it was certainly hurt by the world financial crisis of post-2008. But it did not have to, you know, it did not go deep into debt to do that. Its accounts are still in relatively good shape. So it is a very oil-dependent country, and and prices are up a little bit now from their lows, you know, a year or so ago, so that it has a little bit more breathing room. But when you get, you know, things like sanctions that people talk about now, you know, on energy really bite into Russia. It's very dependent on the energy sector.
You mentioned about the KGB previously coming to the West to train and to learn about Western ideals and things of that nature. My question is this, that is Putin an avid reader at all, do you know? And has he read The Art of the Deal by Henry Schwartz?
I don't know. You know, I would say that the spies didn't come to the West to train and to absorb Western ideals. They came to the West to spy, and that they trained and absorbed Western ideals in order to facilitate their spying. But in Putin's case, he was in Germany when as the East German communism was falling apart, and apparently did not really leave a very good impression on him. I have no idea. Putin is thought to be a very intelligent person with a good understanding of books, but I don't know that people talk about him as a real voracious reader, the way people sometimes talked of, you know, George W. Bush or Bill Clinton, you know.
I want to make one comment about the non-spread of Christianity, which is that it has nothing to do with Russian Orthodoxy. It has to do with the spreading of Christian missionaries from other religions in Russia. I think it's trying to limit that because the Orthodoxy, he's an advocate of the Orthodoxy, and the Orthodox religion is safe and sound in Russia. My question is very specific. It is about Khodorkovsky. Why did he let him go?
I think that this is a guess, okay? Because I mean, I don't think that anyone knows the discussions inside his group. But I think that Khodorkovsky had been in jail for 10 years for a nonviolent crime. That's a long time in European sentencing traditions. He'd been in jail for a long time. There was concerted action on the part of the West to make a big deal of it. And there really was a threat to boycott the Olympics. The Olympics meant a lot to him as a symbol. Russia spent tens of billions of dollars to turn this sort of tropical port into something that was connected by alpine ski areas, by a high-speed rail. It was I don't know how high-speed the rail was, but it was a rather modern type infrastructure project. It was a huge thing, and I think it required a successful Olympics to be to pay off. You know what I mean? But that would be my guess. But as I say, it's a guess.
So we have time for one more question.
Last night, Mark Stein talked about demographics, both in Russia, the Middle East, and Europe and other places. Have the demographic trends, especially with respect to the birth rate in Russia, reversed at all during Putin's time from 2000 to the present?
Not significantly that I know of, but I have not studied them, and I defer to Mark or anyone with newer numbers on it. Well,